Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm Professor Rios, and welcome to Lesson 1 of the Fall 2026 semester. This video is content specific, as opposed to the administrative video that was a welcome video that you hopefully saw before this. This video is actually specifically related to Chapter 1. There will be a little bit of administration at the beginning, but other than that, it is content specific. So having said that, let's begin the lesson. Let me put this in presentation mode. And here is, again, the beginning, Fall 2026. This would be the image that you find in the course guide and syllabus. So it is sort of like the beginning slide of the whole term. So once again, your textbook. We're going to address Chapter 1, which is specifically related to more human geographical concepts. You will not be buying a hard copy of this book. It'll be an ebook. And remember that you have the ability to access it immediately. Even if you don't buy it, you can get a 2-week free trial if you're still debating whether you want to pay for the book itself, basically, for access to Pearson's My Lab in Mastering Geography to complete the course. So that's your decision to make. And you can do it with a 2-week free trial, which gives you access to everything. If you decide you do not want to buy that, and that's, again, your money to spend, then my recommendation is to withdraw from the course, because you cannot complete the course without it. All Pearson-based homeworks managed through Mastering Geography, and you access it via Canvas. And remember, part of the welcome lesson or welcome video was that you pair your Canvas with Pearson. Okay, and you do that by completing, I think, the first intro assignment. These are not timed events, but there is a due date. Google Earth-based homework is accessed also through Canvas. Not timed, but there's a due date. And the weekly chapters that you take on Canvas, those themselves are indeed timed between 15 and 20 minutes. That's it. Very short events. They're meant to be pretty quick-paced, so do not lollygag in them. Again, you get 15 to 20 minutes depending on the length of the quiz itself. So that right there is all the administration for this particular video. Again, if you have any questions related to administration, go to that module in Canvas or watch the video, the welcome video, which address many of these factors. All right, so these are the lesson objectives. We're going to focus primarily on those two terms in the first bullet, globalization and interconnectedness. Specifically globalization, because it kind of runs everything that you essentially interact with on a day-to-day basis, from what you wear to what you eat to where you travel to where your investments may be invested in, and so on. Some of the key concepts that you should hopefully become familiar with. And first, a definition of geography, sort of big macro scale definition. It is both a natural and a social science, which is what makes it unique. You want to examine the spatial interconnections, why do people live where they live? What makes people and cultures choose the particular environments they call home? Remember, culture is something that you learn. They're the learned patterns of behavior of a population. You're not born with culture, you develop it as you get older. Through your interactions with family, friends, and the general population of wherever it is you live. But geography, again, both a natural and a social science. Today, primarily social stuff. Next week, Chapter 2 deals with more of the natural aspects of geography. And in the end, when you look at individual regions, North America, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, you're going to be looking at them through both these prisms, both a natural and a social one. As an old boss of mine at West Point used to say, because places matter. You move to locations for reasons. You may leave New York and go somewhere in Florida or California or Texas or Washington or Colorado. Why? Because there may be a job there that you really, really want and that pays really, really well once you graduate. It may or may not be the region you want to move to as a function of its climate, but you're willing to put up with perhaps a less than ideal climate because the job pays exceptionally well. Or you want to move somewhere because you hate cold weather and you are sick and tired of snow. So you want to move to the South or California or the desert Southwest or whatever the case might be. Places do matter, and you make geographically based decisions all the time without even thinking about it. This is how the book was divvied up by the authors. These are the regions that begin in chapter 3. And you may argue back and forth whether these boundaries are good or not. I think they did a darn good job picking regions. And so this is what defines the, 11 different regions, or is it 12? 12 different regions that we're going to be addressing this semester. All right. And if you think about North America itself, well, this whole region there, which is basically the United States and Canada, while you may argue that, North America is North America and it's pretty sort of plain vanilla, boring throughout, that's really not the case. And if you've traveled anywhere across the US, you know that. And if you ask World Cup fans that came from Europe and Latin America and Asia, they got to find out what actual America was like in Canada. It's very different than what their news media told them. And they found out that very different regions are very different from one another, even within the United States. Again, you would never confuse the Northeast with, say, the South, ever, or you shouldn't anyway. And the same thing goes for Europe and other parts of the world. Again, globalization, this whole term right here, it changes. It is in constant flux. But it is all about increasing interconnectedness, which, by the way, is facilitated by technology. And if you think about what SpaceX is doing in terms of the constellation of satellites that they use for their internet service, that is the ability to connect areas of the world that are remarkably remote, even in 2026. So that's the idea right there, globalization, a company in the United States, now the first $1 trillion company. They're not really the first $1 trillion company, but they're the biggest at this moment. They're bigger than Apple. They're bigger than Microsoft. They're bigger than Google. Whether that lasts or not, who knows? But as of right now, they are. And so the idea of that I think it's, is it Interlink or Starlink constellation, which basically will provide satellite-based internet essentially to the world. Some people argue between 75 and 90% of all internet traffic could eventually be run through them, which is a remarkable statistic. Again, that's globalization. The cultural globalization, you can think of Americanisms, the most significant being a shopping mall. There is really nothing more American than a shopping mall. You may not think so because you may not even think about them anymore. Maybe you don't go shopping at malls anymore. I don't know. I don't know how that changes over time. It was a big deal when I was about your age. It may be less so, but in parts of the world, a mall is still a thing. It's a big thing, and that is an exported American value of shopping and consumerism and all that kind of stuff. Language, or where your stuff comes from. Think about the idea of global shipping. You can look at everything you wear, from those sneakers you love to those Uggs if you wear them, to your hoodie, to your laptop or your tablet or your phone, or pick anything. Start looking at labels and start realizing where it all comes from. India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, China to a lesser extent than it used to be. But that's globalization. Now there are advocates and there are critics, and of course there's an in-between position. So you can think of the pro, the critics, or the middle. And where you fall in here, well, that's your call. So make up your mind, or at least think about it. And this really addresses one of the aspects of the first forum for week 1. Some examples: globalization and migration. So whether it's illegal or illegal migration, and there's plenty of both in many parts of the world. It's less of a thing in the United States now with the Trump administration at the helm, but it used to be less of a thing, or more of a thing rather, prior. It's happening right now in parts of Europe with much migration coming in from places like Morocco and Algeria into Europe. And that's becoming a point of contention. Again, whatever your stance on migration may be. And by the way, if you take away illegal migration in the United States, even at its highest, which I think was 2022, 2023, there was plenty of legal migration into the United States. Plenty. It wasn't like the doors were locked and closed to migration. It was basically going through the proper paperwork and forms and all that stuff. You can think of globalization in energy and the generation and the usage of that energy. And then, of course, China. And I sort of highlight China because along with the United States, they're kind of like the big players right now. What this means for globalization going forward, your guess is frankly as good as mine there. Here's an economic globalization: lithium. So think about your phone, your car, if you drive an EV, your tablet. And these are how many countries is it here? 9 countries that generate the majority of lithium. Notice the US is not on that list. And this is the extraction of lithium ore from the ground in order to generate batteries. And if you ever want to frighten yourself, do a Google search on how much ore, O-R-E, has to be mined in order to generate just one single electric vehicle battery. It's crazy. And do you think, if you like electric cars, fantastic. Get one for each day of the week, but they do not solve the climate crisis even remotely. They're highly polluting. They're not really well recyclable. And when they burn, they release all kinds of nasty stuff into the environment. So they're not exactly the green panacea many people would like them to be. Again, if you love electric vehicles, fantastic. Get one in each color if you can. But again, you have to sort of view, and again, I realize technology in the lithium ion battery or electric vehicle battery changes, and it's changing rapidly. So that may be the thing that makes it more attractive to a lot of people that are not willing to switch from internal combustion energy cars to electrics. Now, cells and tablets and laptops, that's different. That's been a well-proven, well-established technology long before electric vehicles. Here's an economic globalization that's informal, and that would be the drug trade. Wherever you have a demand, something arises to meet its supply. And so that would be the drug trade. So illicit drugs, things that do not have a formal construct behind them. But that's still globalization, and it's still highly economical. Here's the idea of geographic regions. So you have formal. Informal would be in the coral, orange, whatever color that is. You have functional, which in this case would be the purple. And then you have vernacular. So let's begin with vernacular in the green. Silicon Valley doesn't have boundaries. Silicon Valley is the general area where you have lots of companies and schools like Stanford University, where a lot of research takes place. Look at that town, Cupertino. That is where Apple is headquartered, that big circular building of theirs. That's a vernacular region. It's known as Silicon Valley. The functional region, in this case the purple, is the city of San Jose. And the city of San Jose has functional control over everything in that purple. Water, lights, sidewalks, police, fire, all that stuff. Get it? They have functional control. They have a city council and a mayor and that kind of stuff. Now, the yellow or orange rather, that formal region is the Santa Clara Valley, which is a physical valley between two mountain ranges. And you can say, okay, everything in this region is in a valley, and we're going to call that the Santa Clara Valley. So again, the difference between formal, functional, and vernacular. Okay? Here's another way of looking at satellite data and geography. So this is right out of Google Earth. This is the California-Mexico border. Notice how this is a desert region. This is the Mojave. And in this region, you shouldn't be able to grow anything, but because they have siphoned off water from the Colorado River, you can create what's basically in the US called the Imperial Valley right there. And then Mexico has its own version of it. And you can see how they've turned the desert green because it's plenty of heat, plenty of sun, and you've added water and fertilizer, and ta-da! You grow almonds and lettuce and citrus and all kinds of stuff. That's one way of modifying the environment to suit your needs. The human-environment interaction also offers you negative things, like for example, when in 2010, this volcano in Iceland ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that it generated or closed air routes between the United States and Europe, costing billions of dollars in lost productivity. Here's a way of looking at places and the connections, and this is as of October 2025, and these are the different social media platforms. I love how it's spelled with the OU, favorites, how very British, or how very non-American. But these are the most popular apps in the world. Being WhatsApp, for example, is the most popular now, more so than Instagram and Facebook. WhatsApp is an old technology. That app has been around for a very long time. Facebook used to be number one, and they're steadily dropping. And you have TikTok, and you have other ones that you may not be as familiar with because they're very popular in places like Korea, China, and in the Far East. And if you think about, X and Pinterest, a lot of these are very sort of American-centric, whereas WhatsApp is exceptionally popular in Europe. It's very popular in other parts of the world. It's very popular in the United States as well, just not as much because iPhones have their own messaging system and so on. But, a lot of people like to use WhatsApp. In fact, I have a cousin, that's all she uses. It's very annoying. It's the only reason I have it. And now I use it for a lot more than contacting her, which is kind of interesting. Cultural landscape. So this forms the basis of your very first Google Earth homework. The very easy definition. It's the visible material expression of human settlement on the landscape. So when you look at this image right here, it shows you a rice paddy field in the Philippines, in a place that is highly hilly, and you need flat terrain to grow rice. So they have purposely turned their mountainside into a series of steps, which they then can flood and grow rice. Pretty clever. That is a cultural landscape. Probably the most significant cultural landscape on Earth would be religious ones. And this is Borobudur in Southeast Asia. But you can think of the Vatican, you can think of Jerusalem, you can think of Mecca as equally significant religious landscapes. Even if you're not especially strong adherent to a religion, you may go home for the holidays and celebrate the various meals and events that are associated with Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever other religion you may be familiar with or follow. That's what makes cultural landscapes so significant, because even if in the case of religion you're not a particularly strong adherent to it, you still sort of participate in it. Population is a big deal, and most places on Earth are shrinking or at least settling out in terms of growth, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. China, by the way, no longer the most populated country on Earth. Now it's India. The US still holds at 3. And we're now closer to 350 million people in the United States. But, it's a big deal. Population really makes a big difference in terms of everything. And we'll get into that here in a minute. So, for example, you can look at population using pyramids. These are age-sex structures. Female half, male half. And you break it up into 5-year groupings. And you can either tell whether a country is quickly growing because it's got more young people, or shrinking because it has more old people and the young people are not reproducing at the same rate that their predecessors did. The US is headed in that direction, by the way. Or you have a country that slowly grows. That would be the US at the moment. And we are growing, but we are growing slowly. Demographic transition, how a population changes over time. This was initially established to show how Europe transitioned through its population ebbs and flows. The only difference between then and now is Europe had no UNESCO and World Health Organization and Doctors Without Borders or any of that. There wasn't the Bill Gates Foundation giving out vaccines and vitamin E to developing countries across the world. There wasn't any of that when Europe went through it. So you can look at this model in the present day. You just have to look at it, with a grain of salt, because it moves at rates that are not normal if the population were allowed to develop on its own. No population on Earth sits at stage 1. 0. 0 countries on Earth fit this. You have this. Birth rate high, death rate low, population blows up. You have this. Birth rate decreases, death rate levels off. Population grows, but it slows. Or you have death rate decreases. Death rate remains the same. Birth rate decreases and stabilizes at a low rate. And your population sort of keeps up with itself. It doesn't really grow, it doesn't shrink. Or it may grow very, very slowly. Stage 5 is where a country is getting old, like Japan, Italy, South Korea, Spain, where more people are dying that are being born. And that's not a function of disease, that's not a function of health, that's a function of a population that's getting old, and it isn't being replaced with younger people. So in the end, you have more older people, so you're going to have a death rate that's going to be higher by virtue of having more elderly. That's really all that means. Migration is an interesting way of looking at population and movement. Population can be voluntary, forced. There are reasons you move somewhere. There are reasons you stay away from somewhere. And one example would be the slave trade of the 1500s to the 1800s, which primarily came from Western and Equatorial Africa, primarily to South America, and primarily to Brazil. Some to the Caribbean, some to Europe, some to the United States. So that is a forced migration. The other one would have been the Indian or Native American removal from places like Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi into what we now call Oklahoma. And as a result, the Trail of Tears, as a result, Oklahoma has the highest percentage of Native American blood in the background of people who live there. In fact, if you look at their license plate, it has a little dream catcher sort of in the middle of it. It's the most Native American place in the United States right now, Oklahoma. We want to talk about urban settlements. And in the United States, you know, we're such a big country that most of what we'll address here doesn't really apply. But most migration on Earth is from the countryside to cities. That's just the way it is. And in some places, you know, there's a pull. Why are people moving there and generating these, what are in Brazil called favelas? Favelas, which is a organically grown sort of cluster of living spaces. You see this in Brazil. You see this in Caracas. Here it is. In Venezuela. You see this in Rio, where you have these sort of very rustic, poorly planned. They may not have electricity or water, or if it is, it's kind of kludged together next to what are obviously well-developed high-rises, for example. In the way of cultural diversity, the idea of hybridization, and I like to use the example of baseball or cricket. Cricket, a British sport, very, very popular with the Pakistanis and Indians. In fact, it's the biggest sports rivalry on earth. India, Pakistan. Why? Because of their population. It's followed by more people than any other sport between two countries. In the United States, we have baseball, right? But who's the most popular baseball player right now? And that would be the Dodgers' Ohtani. Baseball is exceptionally popular in Japan. Languages and religion. So both of these are a function of migration, and they're a function of colonialism. And where you find, for example, Catholicism or Protestantism or Islam or Christianity is a function of the colonial power that was a force in that region. And in fact, here's the colonial imprint. Again, you can think of Belgium, Austria, Denmark, Spain, Germany. You know, where is Spanish spoken? I like to think of a good example. If you think about the state of Texas, half of Texas from sort of like the middle west, lots of Spanish names. You don't find any Spanish names on the east side. It's all sort of German and English. And that's a function of either a Spanish versus a non-Spanish influence in the region. Again, where you find French, think about Quebec and that French Canadian, which is the only province of Canada where French is spoken more than English, but then the rest of Canada is very sort of English in its background. If you look at some of the flags of, for example, Ontario, it has the Union Jack on it. All right. The geopolitical framework, if you want to, I'm not going to get into the whole Ukraine-Russia thing, but from a geographical point of view, the further east you go in the Ukraine, the more Russian identified this whole area is. People identify more as Russian in their background. The further west you go, the less Russian it is. And so many people here probably had no problem with Russia taking over. Why? Because they identify as Russian. Further west, bigger problem. Development, economic and social. So here you can think of this big broad map, which shows you human development index as a function of all kinds of variables. For example, access to medicine, education, women's rights, those kinds of things, right? And in the blue, very high. In the green and yellow, low to medium. And if you think about a place like Madagascar, you can then further break it down into individual provinces and see how it varies within a country. You can do that within the United States. There are states that are richer than others. Okay? So you could view development within a country, you can view it within a state. For example, you can take New York State and look at how does it vary from the Adirondacks to the Great Lakes region down to the lower Hudson Valley to New York City and Long Island, and view development and economic vigor and strength that way. Of course, health and education. So the idea of women and literacy, the more women are in the workforce and the more educated women are, the lower the birth rates happen to be, because then women are in the workforce and they may either choose not to have any kids, or if they do have them, they have them later. And that's one way of looking at education, looking at the idea of female leaning versus male leaning. In the case of blue, would be more male leaning education versus red, in this case, which would be more female leaning education. And you have countries like Angola and Somalia and Ethiopia and Afghanistan, where males dominate the population that is educated and where women are less so. In reality, you would want to probably be here in the gray. Not too many of those countries that you see here, but that's where you probably want to be. But that's another way of looking at data. Okay, and looking at data can be complicated because it can be tricky and you can do lots of lying with maps, unfortunately. So you have to sort of look beyond the information, but I want you to get a sense of how maps and data from maps can be used to get a story across. All right, so that's lesson 1. That is, again, the more of the human geographical concepts. If you have any questions, please let me know. Again, if there's something that was confusing that you need to have readdressed, let me know. Otherwise, hope you have a great term. Hope you have a great semester. If you have any questions, administratively speaking, if something wasn't clear in the welcome message, then by all means, let me know. Remember, the course opened early, and the first couple of weeks have everything due at the same time. So hopefully you take the time to ease into the course. In any event, hope you have a great term, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.